Okay, so yeah, welcome to the next presentation. We have Dave Hall from Australia calling us from on Google Hangout. He has his session on deploying Drupal. Let us check. Dave, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
So I'm going, yeah. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask him on Twitter, on our, and Dave will be happy to answer. Okay, Dave, you can start.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for having me. Let me start by saying that I'm really disappointed that I'm not there with you. I just couldn't make it there and also make it to LA next week. So I'm joining you remotely, but I'm hoping to be there next year. I'll be giving my presentation on deploying Drupal today. Yep, focus on the right window. So I'm Dave Hall. I'm an IT consultant. I'm a Drupalista. I enjoy hacking on web apps, not just Drupal or PHP. I mess around with a few different things. And when I get bored being a developer, I enjoy being a sysadmin as well. My Drupal experience, I started back with 4.6, just messing around with it. I used 4.7 for a first real project. I did various things with 5 that weren't very interesting or exciting. Drupal 6, I fell into a project where I ended up deploying 2,086 production Drupal 6 sites in less than 52 hours. During that process, I started to realize that deploying Drupal wasn't so easy. Drupal 7, again, I've done a bunch of different things. Dick Olson, who I work with now at Pfizer, one weekend we co-authored the report that recommended that Drupal 8 adopt Symfony components for HTTP routing. And so you can kind of say me and Dick are responsible for Drupal 8 having Symfony in it. If you don't like it, blame Dick. If you do like it, give me the credit. Now, these days I maintain around 50 contrib modules. So I've done a few different things with Drupal. But today I want to talk about actually deploying Drupal. So this is how we all want our deployments to be. This is how we dream our deployments are going to be like. And a lot of the deployments I'm involved in these days do go like this. But we've all been involved in deployments that look more like this. And what I want to talk to you about today is trying to get it more like this than like that. And there's a few things I've learned which can help get you there. So the first thing is proper planning prevents poor performance. Now, this doesn't just apply to Drupal. It doesn't just apply to deployments. It applies to just about anything you do. So the first thing you need to do is you need to map everything out. Now, we regularly map out our content types. We map out which contrib modules we'll use, which base theme we'll use. We get wireframes done to map out what the UI will look like. There's all this stuff that gets mapped out, but deployments generally aren't in that plan. They're not in the map. If we have a project roadmap, deployment is right on the end. It's a thing that happens usually hours before the new site is due to be launched. And that's where a lot of the problems come from, because this stuff isn't planned enough in advance. So the first thing we need to look at is our environments. Now, what type of environment is this site going to exist in? Is there just going to be production? Is it going to be one of these projects where everything just happens on production? Your FTP files there, you know, if something's a bit dodgy, you'll just, you know, change a file, deploy it, cross your fingers and hope that it works? Or are you going to have a proper dev stage production workflow? Now, this makes things a bit more complicated when it comes to how you plan things, but if you know about it from the start, it makes life a lot easier. Are you going to use blue-green deployment? Now, there's probably quite a few people in the room looking at this slide wondering what the blue and the green means. So the green is what's currently live now. So we have a live dev environment, a live stage environment, and a live production environment. And then we have the offline blue environment. So what we do as part of the deployment is copy everything from dev to offline dev if we're doing a dev deployment. And then we make all the changes in the offline environment. So we run our database updates, our features reverts, you know, anything else that needs to be done, even pre-prime the caches if needed or whatever. And then when we're happy, we switch the offline dev and the online dev. Now that can be done by changing a symlink, updating a load balancer configuration. You could update DNS, but that's a pretty slow way of doing it. And there's a bunch of considerations for doing blue-green deployment, but if you're going to do blue-green deployment, this isn't something that you decide, you know, a week out from launching the site that you're going to use blue-green deployment. You need to plan this stuff well in advance so the site is built to support this deployment model from day one. Then you also need to work out what the target platform is. Now, I know in a lot of projects, it's a client says it'll be hosted on platform X, and you just have to make it work on that platform. But you should find out what that target platform is as early as possible. For example, if it's going to be on HostGator, then it's probably time to look for another client or look for another job, because it's not going to be much fun doing those deployments. Hosting on AWS, that's great, but who's going to build out the AWS environment? Who's going to maintain it? How are you going to get code into those environments, and so on? These are all things that need to be planned. And each of these different targeted Drupal hosting platforms, they're all different. So if you're building a deployment system, if you're going to be deploying onto Pantheon, it's going to be different if you're deploying onto platform.sh or Acquia or Omega 8. So you just need to really plan that stuff in advance. Then your local environment. Now, normally I would do a show of hands, but everyone here fits into about a 50 pixel by 50 pixel square, so it's a bit hard for me to see hands. But I'm assuming if I asked for a show of hands that there would be at least a few people who develop locally on Windows yet deploy onto a Linux server. Now that makes things really difficult for trying to debug problems and just having an understanding of what's going on in the environment the site's being deployed into. So you really should be trying to get your local environment as closely as possible to production. Now, a couple of great tools for that. One is Vagrant, which will allow you to build a virtual machine in an automated way, and it gives you disposable environments which can closely replicate your production environment. So if you're not already using Vagrant, I would strongly recommend that you at least have a look at it and see if it's going to be useful for your projects. The second tool, which is getting very popular these days, is Docker, which is a containerized environment. So if you want to, like virtual machines, they all need their own memory, their own disk. They end up taking up a fair bit of space. Whereas with Docker, it allows you to have completely isolated environments, and they're quite fast to spin up. So if you are running on Linux, it can be a faster way of building out dev environments. So now that, the other thing that you should be planning as part of your deployment is how do you get stuff from production back to your local environment? Normally as developers, we're used to working locally and pushing everything remotely, but when we're dealing with Drupal, which is a content management system, there may be taxonomies that you need to be able to create your views and things like that. So you need to figure out a way of getting data from production back to your local environment. At the same time, you need to look at protecting sensitive data that's on the production site. So you probably want an automated process for scrubbing databases before they're given to developers. And you probably don't want a developer, every time they want a database dump, I'll just SSH into production and grab the dump, or run Drush SQL sync on their local machine. Running Drush SQL sync is great, but if you get the arguments around the wrong way, you've just synchronized your local database to production, and you're not going to be very popular with either the client or the rest of the dev team if you mix that one up. So, hang on. So the next thing we need to look at is deploying code. Now, as developers, it's one of the main things that we will work with. For other people on the project, they're still very concerned about content, about code, because it's what drives the content. So you really should be using a version control system. If you're using Git, that's great. If you're using Subversion, you have my sympathies. Ideally, your deployment system will be well integrated with your version control system. Now, if you're on Git, there is a bunch of tools out there that integrate with Git. And if you're on GitHub, there's some that provide quite targeted integrations with GitHub. So there are a bunch of options there. If you're using other tools, there are services around to assist you as well. Also, organize your code properly. So, make sure that you structure it, implementing best practices and stuff like that. So plan the code from the start and have it well known within the team. So use consistent naming conventions and things like that. Content, well, Drupal's a content management system. We need to be able to deploy content. Maybe it's a case that someone is working locally on some things and they've created some beans for deploying for blocks on a site. Or with Drupal 8, they're creating just core blocks and they need some way of getting that through to production. Now, a common way of deploying content is what I like to call the content or database catapult. You get your whole database dump, you put it on the catapult, and then you launch it over the wall and hope that everything lands on production as you intended. The other reason why I like to call it the database catapult is that catapults are great at smashing things. And if you get things wrong with the database catapult, you can end up smashing your site. Now, a disclaimer here, I'm the co-maintainer of the deploy module. So I'm a big fan of using more targeted tools for deploying content. I think that the deploy module is great. It's more like a slingshot. You fire small targeted changes from one environment to the next. And if you set things up properly and have the right security model, you can even deploy content from your local machine to a remote dev environment. There is also backup and migrate, which I personally don't use. You can use that, but it doesn't always handle dependencies properly for you. So, and there is the migrate module, but that's more for pulling data from one system to another. If you haven't looked at deploy, I recommend you check it out. But that's the end of the sales pitch for deploy. Now, the final piece that we need to look at deploying is our configuration. Now, with Drupal 7, features is how everything gets moved around, or sometimes people avoid features and just use CTools exportables or exported configuration entities. There's a few different ways of doing it, but essentially you're dumping your configuration out to code in one form or another. Drupal 8, we've got CMI, which moves that configuration from code to YAML files, which is great. Now, with the one thing with features, this is my little rant about what I think people do wrong with features, is putting features in a separate directory doesn't really help you much, because features are still modules. Sure, they've got configuration in them, but there's nothing stopping you implementing a hook that does something else that helps make your feature complete. So I always recommend that you keep your features in a single, in the same directory as your custom code. The other thing that you'll find that really helps with your deployments is if you keep all of your field bases in a common feature, because that way you don't end up with creating dependencies between your features, which can be problematic when it comes to deployments. And also with version control. So in an ideal world, this ice cream is what Drupal should be like. The pink should be the nice, sweet content. The white is the nice configuration. And then the brown is the code. Now, sometimes the code is browner than others, but in an ideal world, we'd have nice Neapolitan ice cream with the three of them separated. This is the reality of Drupal. It's rainbow ice cream. It's all kind of mixed together. We can separate bits of it out, but this stuff's, the dependencies are all intermixed. And so in Drupal 7, we have configuration depending on code, and we use features and other things to allow us to make that work. In Drupal 8, we have it depending on we have configuration depending on content. For example, in Drupal 8, we have a block. Now, the placement of that block is handled by CMI, and so that says where it's to be placed, but the actual content of that block, which is specified by the configuration, is content. So the two of those are still dependent on each other. And I don't think that we will ever, with Drupal, get to the place where we have that nice Neapolitan ice cream container. It's always going to be more of that rainbow. Now, that's fine as long as we accept when we're planning our deployments that that's the way things are. And if we push too hard to get those clear separations, we're going to bend Drupal in ways that it's not really designed to bend. So once we've got our deployment system and we're reasonably happy with it, we need to look at automating it, because one of the key things with deployments is computers don't make mistakes, people do. Every time we have a human being responsible for clicking buttons or mashing on keyboards to get deployments done, there's a risk that they're going to stuff something up. And generally, the more pressure there is around a deployment, the higher the likelihood is that they're going to stuff it up. So I would strongly recommend that you automate your processes. Another advantage is that you can, when you've got automated deployment processes, you can plug your automated test suite in and other automated steps to end up with a system that a person would have to babysit all day if it was done by a human. But because it's done by a computer, it just keeps on cranking out the steps as it's told to do. So if you're doing, if you want to do behavior-driven development and use Behat, that's great. You can plug that in. If you're doing stuff in Drupal 8, then use PHP Unit. With Drupal 7, we're stuck with Simple Test. It does the job. And so look at having tests built into your processes, not only to catch obvious mistakes, but there may be smaller things that are slipping through. And when you automate things, have Jenkins or some other CI system or automation tool handle things. Now, Jenkins started off as a CI system, but you can make Jenkins do pretty much anything. There's a text box, you just punch in a bash script and it'll do what it's told to do. Jenkins is a Java app. It's pretty easy to set up. If you're not comfortable setting up Jenkins yourself, I am more than happy to recommend CloudBees, which offers hosted Jenkins. So there's a free plug for them. And yeah, Jenkins will make your life a lot easier. Now, with this stuff, test it early and test it often. Don't just wait until 2 weeks out before your site goes live to start working on the deployment stuff. Each time you want to push stuff live, use the same deployment system. And that way you get the kinks out of your deployment system early. If you're waiting till the end of the process, you're going to be under a lot of pressure, and that's not the ideal time to be dealing with issues in your deployment process. So decide on a process and start using it early and get comfortable with it, because that will really allow you to iterate on it just like you do the rest of the code. The other really important thing is to actually document your deployment process. So if you don't want to go to all the hassle of setting up your own wiki and having everything stored in there, if you're already using GitHub, use the GitHub wiki. There's the link right beside your code repository, so then you can have your processes, your deployment process documented there, and anything else related to that that project can all be documented in that wiki, and the two of them sit side by side. And you can even use Git to manage your GitHub wiki, because it's all just stored as text files in Markdown. Another really important thing is to understand your site. Like, you know, there's tools like New Relic, which will tell you a heap of information about your site. Google Analytics will give you a bunch of information about users moving through. And all of this mountain of data, there's nice graphs and stuff, but unless you understand what the normal patterns are, it's useless. So understand what's going on with the site. Is it always the case that after a deployment for 20 minutes, there's an extra, I don't know, 250, 500 millisecond delay on page loads? Is that because caches are being rebuilt, or is it because certain things are happening, or does it mean that someone pushed bad code? Like, you know, if you don't understand the site, trying to understand this stuff when something's gone wrong is the wrong time to be learning. You're going to be jumping to the wrong conclusions. So spend some time understanding how your site performs. And, you know, if you push code and, you know, it leads to a 5 or even 10% decline in sales conversions, you don't want to find that out when the monthly sales report comes out. You want to have a system in place that allows you to track that stuff early, so you know if your changes are being effective or if there's been an issue with a particular deployment. And tools like New Relic also allow you to log in the New Relic interface via an API call when a deployment is. So you can actually see those show up, which help you identify the normal patterns and the abnormal patterns. Another key thing is communication. Technology is a wonderful thing, but, you know, walking across the room to talk to someone else you work with, or if you're part of a distributed team, as I prefer to work, hassling someone else on Slack when you've got a question is a great way to get things solved. So if you notice something with a deployment that you don't think is right, call it out, talk about it, and have the team talk about deployments. It shouldn't just be, you know, the scary person in the corner who doesn't have great social skills, who's a master of servers, that takes care of this stuff. It should be the whole team understands it, because, you know, each deployment process that relies on one person is one bus away from being a broken deployment process. So make sure that there's knowledge being shared and that people are raising their concerns around this stuff and raising them early. And the other thing is, none of this is set in stone. This can change and evolve just like your code does. Deployments shouldn't be a fixed thing. It should be something that evolves over time. And for example, one of the projects that I'm currently on, starting not next week, the week after, we will actually be going to daily releases. We've been doing weekly releases for a year now, and we've finally decided that we've got enough confidence up that we can push whatever's ready by close of business one day. First thing the next morning, the team will push that stuff live. And the whole thing of never deploy on Friday, because we've got our processes down, we're so confident we'll be deploying on Fridays as well. But we'll be doing it in the morning, not at 6 o'clock in the evening. And you know, that's something that has grown out of this team. And there's other stuff which I'm working on at the moment that provides continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So anytime something's ready, that stuff can go live. So it's really up to you to work out what the best process is for your team. There are particular things that people describe as best practice, and that should be your starting point. But you know, sometimes innovation comes out of ignoring best practice and doing something different. So, you know, this is something that you should work on. And for everyone who thought that you get out of a presentation without seeing a set of bullet points, I thought I'd leave them till the end. And so, and I am actually going to read the bullet points. So the first thing is planning, and more planning. All of this stuff needs to be planned. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go for a waterfall approach, but plan this stuff, think it through, and make sure that it's happening early. Try to make things as consistent as possible. So make your dev and stage as close as possible to each other. Make your stage and prod as close to each other. And also make your local environment as close as possible to those. Because if you're trying to replicate an intermittent bug that is only happening on production, but all of your other environments are different, you're going to have to figure out a way of debugging that one on live production, which is never fun. Automation prevents mistakes. So, you know, let Jenkins do the work, because he's just happy sitting there doing the same thing day in, day out. Developers, they get bored. So, you know, get them doing something that offers real value rather than repetitive tasks. Communicate. Make sure people know when the next deployment is, what's going to be in that deployment. Were there any issues with the previous deployment? You know, make sure, and you know, documentation's all part of this as well. Make sure that people are aware of what's happening with your deployments. And also make sure you know your site, and not just one person who is a business person who knows what the sales conversions are. Make sure you understand like the performance of the site from front end through to back end, so you can actually debug things and start looking in the right areas. And adapt as you learn. As I said, this stuff isn't set in stone. You know, try some things out. If it doesn't work, you know, what, you had one bad deployment out of a bunch of successful ones, or you know, it did work, and so you've got this great new thing that's saving your team time or whatever. Now, I thought that I would actually put a slow-mo video of when you've got all this stuff working properly, what it looks like. Now, hopefully the Hangout, the video works well enough. So let's see how we go. So this is a deployment in slow motion when it all comes together properly. There you go. So actually, if anyone knows what movie that's from, feel free to put it on Twitter. It's actually a Macedonian movie. So yeah, that's it all working properly. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks everyone for your time. I'll take questions on Twitter, and yeah, hopefully next year I'll be there.
I have a question. How many years do you work Drupal?
So I started, I think it was 2000 and 2006, I started messing around with it, and I started being somewhat serious in 2008. But, you know, most of this stuff hasn't actually come from my Drupal experience. It's actually come from my general sysadmin experience.
Okay, so yeah, Schnitzel was talking about Drupal 8. What do you think about the new Drupal version?
I'm really excited about Drupal 8. I think that there's a lot of potential there to solve some of the historic issues with Drupal, like stuff around CMI, stuff around web services. You know, with me, I can kind of throw together something that is responsive, but I'm better at the back end stuff. So if Drupal's going to take care of a lot of the mobile stuff for me, that makes my job even easier.
Okay, so and what do you do for consulting? How do you consult people?
I will do whatever they're paying me to do, basically. So at the moment I have 3 clients. My main client is Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company. I'm part of the core engineering team there. And so I work as part of the team that tries to build a rock solid Drupal platform and deployment system for those sites. So we currently have, over 500 custom build Drupal sites. And in a quiet week, we launched 2 or 3. And we have hundreds of Acquia Site Factory or Acquia Drupal Garden sites. And just this week, we were named by Information Week magazine as being the 10th most innovative company in the US when it comes to technology. And that was for our Drupal work. And we were also named as having one of the 20 ideas worth stealing, again being how we do our web presence with our use of Drupal and our internal Center of Excellence team.